Hello, 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 and welcome to the second installment of Genomic Conversations on LoveDigenous. I am Joseph Irshutta, and these are my two friends here to talk about tribal sovereignty and DNA. So, the title of this is Those Who Control the Past Control the Future: DNA Sovereignty and the Savior Myth here in the United States. Um, John Wayne once said it wasn't wrong to take America away from the indigenous people because they were selfishly trying to keep it for themselves. For centuries, the world has used excuses like altruism and progress to rewrite Native history, steal land, and today even claim ownership over Native DNA. As I said, I'm Joe Rashetta. I'm an Indigenous genomicist. I live and work on the Cheyenne River Sioux Reservation. In this episode, we are cutting through the academic polite talk. We are breaking down the mechanics of colonization, how Tucsoans, or the United States of Americans, understand Native rights, Indigenous data sovereignty, and who actually owns Indigenous history. Let's dive in. Today, we have with us my two friends, Kyle Sullivan and Brier Buchalter. I'm going to let them introduce themselves and start the conversation. Go ahead, Kyle.
Hello, I am Kyle Sullivan, filmmaker, director, YouTuber, and I don't know. I think that's it. That's all the appellations that I can think of. Um, yeah, what else do you want to know?
So how did you come to this conversation?
Right. I've been interested in indigenous issues for quite a while. I bumped into Joseph because I had made a video about Native American representation in Star Trek. Deep well of conversation, that one. And it attracted his attention. And then you brought me out to Cheyenne River and other places to film the many adventures of the Native Biodata Consortium.
And how about you, Mr. Buchalter?
Hey, well, I usually just go by Brier, and it's great to be here. We met online on a community where discussing social, political issues, the arts, all sorts of things, and I think we had a shared interest and concern in the rights for Indigenous peoples and communities, and what's hurting them, and how that could be stopped. My background's in education, so I've been teaching for well over 20 years. I especially specialize in teaching philosophy, political issues, but really through a lens of academic speech and debate. So I've run organizations throughout the country, some national organizations, and coached at a elementary through university level. And I think why we resonated on this was several years ago, there was a topic area in academic debate. We go through different subjects, and it was on uh, genetic rights, both of Indigenous people and of the resources they had. And it was talking about bioprospecting, which is a term I didn't even know at the time, going out to uh, Indigenous communities and trying to find what knowledge they have about traditional medicines and treatments, and then trying to patent them and lock them down in large corporations or governments or universities to try and take that and then own that and then make resource off of it. And we shared a lot of, back and forth on that. I think that's probably what brought me here, and it's something both of us I think care a great deal about. So I'm really glad to be a part of this.
Yeah, and so for our audience, the first or the inaugural episode of this podcast, I brought two other Euro descendant folks. One was Dr. Jennifer Raff, who wrote the book Origins, the Peopling of the Americas. She's an ancient DNA or archaeological or anthropological geneticist, and she has very little contact with biomedicine or big pharma or anything like that. And but she did talk about how her and other archaeologists are being very careful because of past complaints and harms in this archaeological, anthropological space. Kenny McMahon is probably the best known. Other ones are Anzac, Hoyo Negro, which is the Naya skeleton in the Yucatan. Lagoa Santa is in Brazil, which is she's been named Luzia. All of these things have angered a lot of Native people and populations across space and time. And so she talked about how that's beginning to change. Even Elizabeth Weiss, if you guys know who that is, she was a researcher at San Jose State who basically claimed that natives should not be allowed to claim or stop science through NAGPRA or any other means because she considered it a religious um, a religious ban on doing the work, and saying that because we're the United States and we have a separation of church and state, that she as a researcher should be able to do whatever she wants with the bones of Native American ancestors. In any case, the United States is moving across and using these siloed policies and laws to get around tribal sovereignty or any tribal consultation or engagement. They have currently up on the books an announcement scheduled for 2027 to take ancient DNA that's not protected by NAGPRA, resequence, curate, harmonize, and give it to the NIH and Big Pharma. So that's where she was helpful. And then the other gentleman, Dr. Jim Tabery, is an ethicist at the University of Utah, and does talk a lot about biomedicine. And he gave his contributions about how, since the late 60s to the current era, if you guys don't know, the Belmont Report in 1979 was not established in this country for informed consent until 1979. So any data that or samples that were collected before that point were kind of up for grabs. They're now called legacy samples, and people are trying to figure out what to do with them. But that was an interesting conversation between the two of them. And similarly, I have Kyle and Brier here because I feel like they can help me explain to the public why they should care about Indigenous sovereignty issues, especially over genetics, because eventually it's going to come for them as well. And then subsequent episodes of this podcast, I will have Native scholars and grassroots people talking about similar issues. But I wanted to start putting the best foot forward with my friends here who can explain to outsiders why this is such important. And so, with that, I'm going to go back to Brier. Brier just recently helped describe to a physicist friend that we have. And I'd been talking to this physicist friend for at least 3 years, and he wasn't quite getting it. But Brier was able to turn that little key in his brain and make him understand.
Yeah, that was an interesting conversation. I think one of the challenges, and frankly, I face this as well, is a lot of times we view Indigenous issues as a narrow thing that's very consequential for a small population. And unfortunately, there's a strong history, especially in the Americas, of ignoring that or putting it as a special case that we deal with in a very limited way. So several years ago, when I was first exposed to this issue, I think it's really important to acknowledge what we don't know and what we could know. And when I first heard of the idea of tribal genetic sovereignty, tribal biodiversity, indigenous rights on property, especially intellectual, I really didn't think it was going to be this massive thing for the farm industry. And then when I started looking into it, the stats started to blow me away. So when I was talking to this physicist, he's very bright and I think he's a good person, really cares, but it seemed like one of those issues where this is solved by the government righting a wrong or something. The systemic nature didn't come out. So one of the things I explained to him was that one of the original traditions of modern medicine was something called bioprospecting, which, like I mentioned earlier, is going into areas with a lot of biodiversity, which just means a lot of natural life. So think a rainforest or something like that, or parts of the coastal regions that are really full of different types of animals and plants and different resources. And indigenous people have been using that for millennia, not just centuries, but millennia to develop complex treatments for, I mean, everything from diabetes and food suppression to agriculture and pest prevention to lowering blood pressure to treating heart swelling. And what happened was scientists for a long time kind of almost fetishized this and wanted to go out into these natural environments and come back with the miracle cure that the indigenous mind had. And over time, as things became more modern, that became a tool that big pharma, universities, and powerful nation states used to go into these indigenous communities and extract what they could. And so explaining to him why it mattered, I think what was useful was explaining that 25%, most estimates put it around 25% of all modern pharmaceuticals were developed in this way. So it's not a small thing. And when you think about 25% of all pharmaceuticals, that's not billions with a B, that's trillions with a T in revenue that comes from doing this. It looks at things like some of the first, the first one of the first treatments that was most effective at treating leukemia in children came from investigating a plant in Madagascar that the indigenous people had been using, and different examples like this. And so the utility of this is so high. And then I also had to explain to him that, well, why is this different from other types of learning? Because these cultures didn't patent things. They shared through oral, mostly oral, not written tradition. They shared what medicine worked and it was considered an abundant resource. Then these companies go and do a little bit of patenting the process of how to extract these chemicals. And then they go on to make billions and trillions of dollars. And in some instances, don't compensate the indigenous at all or minimally. And so think of the amount of money if we took, this trillion-dollar industry and we gave it back to indigenous peoples, the amount of development would be phenomenal. And then also talking about why are people targeting, and this one I was really unaware of until semi recently, is the genetic data of indigenous peoples is really valuable. So what happens over time is when people are sequestered by time and space, you have both epigenetics, so the expression of genes, which we're finding about between generations, but also actual natural mutations to live with the surroundings. So I don't know about your communities, Joseph, but when I was a young man, I was exposed a lot to the Arapaho community, and it was very influential in my upbringing. And like some cultures will say amen when they're done with the lost ceremony, they say that the translation would be all my relations. So they view the physical earth, the waters, the sky, plants, animals, even history and ancestors as intimately related to them. And as these groups evolved with their environment, their genetics evolved. So a classic example that's almost become a cliche in some circles is studying Inuit communities in the far north that live on mammal diets and how have they evolved to survive on those diets but not have high rates of cardiovascular disease. That's the number one killer of Americans, right? So if we can extract something from their genetic and biomarkers and figure out how they've evolved, that's one of the most valuable discoveries we can make. And I think it just clicked with him seeing the value and the exploitation. And so I think for a lot of people, they just need to hear about that. And it makes sense when you do.
Yeah, and so for the audience, the term is mitako ye oyasi, at least for the Lakota, it means all my relations. And I was just in New Zealand and the Maori, this guy um, he had made a 3D replica of a conch shell that they used to blow in, right? And he said, "This is great because we don't have to use the real one because it has sacred meaning. It has a cultural patrimony where people don't want it to be out in public all the time. So they found a solution by making a fake resin one with this 3D printer, and it sounds almost the same. It feels the same. And then I'm like, yes, but does it? And I can't remember what the word, if it's mana, but does it have any spirit? Does it have any essence? And most of the people in the room said no. And both he and I answered exactly the same, like, yes, it does, because it came from the earth, didn't come from outer space. They used to be dinosaurs, and now now they're this plastic resin that is making up this artificial conch shell. But yeah, so now to Kyle. Um, Similarly, what kind of white whisper techniques do you have? Because when I met you, or when I found you on YouTube, you were talking about how Star Trek is something we should aspire to. Like Gene Roddenberry was a visionary, especially at the time, right? Because they didn't want to see Mr. Spock, they didn't want to see Uhura, they didn't want to see any of these people on TV, right? And so we moved forward. They had some native representation, and then they went to Chakotay, which kind of messed everything up. And even now, with Starfleet Academy and Strange New Worlds, they've kind of moved away from the whole native thing together. They have a lot of representation of ethnicities in the future, but like for the proxy for natives is Latinos, which is Ortega and a couple of other characters, but there's no actual defined Native Americans.
Yeah, Star Trek. I consider it an imperial bellwether. It's 60 years old this year. Trapped inside of that is all the mythologies of the United States, good and ill. a continuing conversation about what it means to be the empire that we are, who gets to be in the room, who doesn't. Like Worf to me is more of an indigenous character, like you said, Klingons. He gets to be on the bridge and he wants to express himself, but he can only do it so much. You can't be full, can't go around killing people, Worf. Yeah, we'll let you wear the sash, but speak English, And I, it is sort of like an optimistic sort of thing, but
And
I
don't
think,
eat those weird foods like gah.
gawk, yeah, worms, live worms. Uh, it's I don't really think I would consider it totally optimistic anymore. Like I grew up that way, watching Star Trek that way. I think it's more of like an idealized version of what the Imperial United States wants to do with itself, and who's driving that bus? It's usually the ruling ethnic group, aka European Americans. But I think sci-fi in general is really great for having conversations about these exact kind of thorny topics. Like I don't know if you guys ever saw Gattaca back in the 90s, like a brilliant, weird science fiction movie, kind of about genetics and, who gets to be in the master race and who doesn't. And Star Trek can have those conversations if it wanted to, but sci-fi in general is having them. And I think, it's a valuable space for the public to fight about these ideas.
Yeah, it's weird how, because like I was watching West Wing and how prescient they were for this moment in time. Like they predicted this way back when West Wing was on TV. So was William Gibson, so is Star Trek, so like a whole bunch of science fiction uh, writers or themes and movies predicted where we are now. It's kind of scary.
Yeah. And that's the rule that, I mean, you like the Prime Directive video? Like, that's the rule. The reason they have that in Star Trek is because of the colonial history in real life. Like you were talking about indigenous medicines earlier and about exploitation. Like, that started from day one. Like, the Aztec pharmacopoeia was massive, and like Europeans benefited from just getting to know it, and the tale is old as time.
Yeah, and Brier brought it up a little bit. I'm really focused on human DNA, but like for plant medicines or agricultural crops, like we fed the world. I can't remember what it was. We're like in the top 20. There's seven native crops in the top 20. If you exclude cotton, tobacco, and rubber, which are, those are
Mm-hmm.
all from the Americas, but if you just count food, it's corn,
Mm-hmm.
tomatoes, peppers, peanuts, potatoes, sweet potatoes, cassava, chocolate, vanilla. Those are all from here, and no native gets any money for those things.
Yeah.
I mean,
Charles C. Mann said something like 60 to 70% of the foods the world eats is American in origin, which is crazy.
I was blown away because when I try and think of Italian cuisine, like even as a young person, when I heard this, I thought I misunderstood it. Think of Italian cuisine, what we experience, especially in Americas, without any pepper or tomato.
Hmm.
Picture a lot of like Asian cuisine without those peppers. And indigenous people aren't just, we've been talking about the United States, but like there's South Asian indigenous, there's all sorts of different indigenous communities that were colonized in different ways. And so much of that food came from, development over millennia. A great thing to do if anybody wants to Google this is like look what the original watermelons or potatoes or corn, they were nearly inedible. Like it's a miracle that these people spent centuries developing them and breeding them. And I think that's one of the things that when I think about indigenous rights and development, we're talking about data, right? There's this idea that indigenous people had no data. It's all just kind of oral traditions. And now we have computers and record keeping. It's valuable. There's a professor, Dr. Stephanie Carroll, and she has a great TED Talk where she talks about this and the different ways that people store data. And there's, everything from wampum and the Inca had this, I think it's called a kapu, if I'm not saying it wrong. And they
People,
would a
people, yeah.
kipu. Yeah, they would tie knots and dye threads to keep complex records that were way ahead. When the Spanish came to look at the Mayan and Incan empires, they didn't look at them as backwards. They actually thought they were so incredibly civilized, having really complex like dietary structure, formal meal settings. I mean, the fact that they bathed multiple times a week and had etiquette for how to eat food, they looked at them as not ancient, they were extremely progressive. They were like this society that had norms and culture and advanced aquaculture. And so I think one thing I'm always afraid of is thinking that there was little value. The indigenous like just figured out how to eat some plants. No, they were breeding and selecting, and so it's not a dead culture, an ancient culture. It's really bad. It was really what helped push. Think of like potato famines, all these things. Those couldn't have even happened if they hadn't been benefiting off these American indigenous developments. So
Yeah, and
yeah,
so to that point, so I like I said, I was just in New Zealand, and and to use you guys as the majority culture whisperers for me, um, the way of ocean finding, the Polynesians had a version of a sextant that they used to map the stars, and they actually did better at night getting through the ocean than they did during the day. Um, and people like assume they couldn't do this because they were starving on the ocean. They accidentally found these islands, and they didn't have any way to find their way. Plus, their boats would couldn't tack that much into the wind, because like modern sailboats can tack 30 degrees into the wind. They thought maybe the double-hulled canoes might be able to do a little bit less than 90, but now we find out it was, probably 45 degrees or even less, that they could tack into the wind. So all of these assumptions they had about Polynesians and getting around the Pacific, and now they science, genomics, a whole bunch of other things, testing out sailboats and wind patterns shows they were very sophisticated. Yet, in racist popular culture, they're still thought of as violent, as alcoholics, as primitive, as troublemakers, whatever you want to say. The Polynesians are still thought of that way, even though science has said no. To Brier's point, they've already been shown to do all these things. And to Kyle's prime directive, he has a really good example how the Europeans in Australia learned something about a certain kind of root, but they didn't learn everything. And then they accidentally off themselves.
Yeah, the Burks and Wills expedition. Nardu bread, the Nardu seed, it's toxic if you eat it. And Aboriginal Australians figured out a long time ago how to make it into a bread that didn't kill you. And this expedition was wandering around the outback, starving to death, and like they found the Nardu bread and found enough, were taught enough to make it, but not to detoxify it. Scared off the original people. It's like we'll take it from here, and then they starved to death. They poisoned themselves to death slowly over a couple of weeks, and it's a doomed expedition. And there are
Yeah, and I
monuments in
wonder,
Australia for it.
maybe you memorized it, but I like the end of that video because you talked about United States as one of the largest, most successful empires in the history of humans. They should be teaching everybody from a young age how to be global citizens. If you could say that again for Breyer, because it's exactly the point he was trying to make is like we're all differently abled.
Right. So like Brier was pointing out earlier, when the Europeans first got to the Americas, they found incredible nations and societies and doing all kinds of stuff. Like it was not a monolith of cultures. It was highly diverse. And in a couple of places in particular, like there were these massive cities and like there was these they saw that first brush and they're like these people are really something. There's a lot here. There's a lot to exploit here, but there's a lot here that we don't have back home in Europe, and that got buried real quickly under a power dynamic like of exploitation and nation state building and European empires, brushing shoulders with each other, and then the rise of the United States, and like it became myth, this master race stuff, this racism, this Nazism stuff, um, for generations, as the United States was just becoming a thought in someone's eye, which, by the way, was partly an indigenous idea. And the United States of America has made its greatest exploitations off of populations, where it cast a super wide net of all kinds of different thought patterns and peoples, and that is where like our greatest success comes from. And anytime you boil a population of people down to just a couple of important of what you think are important ingredients and you ignore everything else, you're going to lose economically. The vitality of your culture is going to dwindle. And like to me, the prime directive of the United States should be like you have to really, if you want to be the most powerful strident empire on the planet, I mean, ethics aside, you need to lean into that diversity. You need to open every book that even authored by indigenous people or not. You have to cast a wide net. And like one of the reasons we're so militarily successful is that we have access to all kinds of different terrain. Like we can train our soldiers in the Arctic and the desert and the rainforest because we own all these places in the empire. So if we have to go fight a war with some Middle Eastern country, we can take our guys out to the Southwest and practice in the desert. Like not every country has that capability. You know, just militarily speaking, battles have been won and lost on on really tiny technicalities, like how hot people get and the uniforms are handed, or weapon systems that are adapted to certain areas and not to other areas. Like the Europeans came rolling in 500 years ago with matchlock pistols that barely worked. They got rained on. They didn't work. They didn't have the weapon systems that the local populations had. The Inca, for example, had these really gnarly sling type things where they'd take a rounded stone, drop it into hot, like boiling oil, put it into a cotton sling and sling it. As they were slinging it, would catch fire in the air and rain fire down their enemies. And like the Europeans were like, what? And they had tools adapted to Europe, but they weren't adapted to those tools. So I don't know. If you're going to be a successful empire like the United States, it's not just enough to put flags on the moon. You got to pay attention to everybody in your realm equally because you don't know where the really great ideas are going to come from. And the case in point is the United States itself. The whole idea that democracy was invented by a bunch of white guys on the eastern coast of America, like in a vacuum, descendants of Europe, which was like 2,000 years of theocratic kingdoms, is laughable when you start reading the things they actually wrote about where some of those ideas came from. Like this Iroquoian Haudenosaunee idea of democracy, and you're like, holy crap, what does it even mean to be an American? Like it is based in part in some slice of indigeneity, or those ideas came from indigenous people. So now we're suddenly going to look the other way. Not if you want to be the king of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's one of the tough things whenever you're talking about this sort of subject matter is people want to look good. Like our culture is really focused on appearances and social media and status and economic, a lot of different things have pressed us to appear as if we are good people. And a lot of times I think people fight more to look good than to do good. Because sometimes doing good doesn't look great on the surface. So I think a lot of times acknowledging the messiness and the challenges of what's there, it's not a nice, easy conversation and you're going to stumble through it. And I think that a lot of people, when we talk about the history of the Americas, they want to look good. So they want to be like, I'm going to do a land acknowledgement. We're good. I've acknowledged that this land, we're sitting on stolen land. And then other people like just give land back. A lot of the indigenous thinkers look and say, no, there's more basic things we could do that might be more pragmatic. I mean, if we gave land back, we'd have to cede the United States. Now you have 340 some odd million refugees, a bigger number ever in history. And what happens with all those refugees? What country's going to take them in? Nowhere could. So what are they probably going to do? Well, whatever land we give back, there'll probably be a violent rebellion and they take it back once again, which might just induce greater cycles of violence. So, and that's an awkward conversation to have. Like, what do you authentically do? So I think that keeps us from looking at some pragmatic steps, like honoring tribal treaties and giving legitimate sovereignty, uh, allowing for direct financial compensation for exploitation. I mean, there's so much that would change. I think it wasn't that long ago when they looked at treaties and said functionally the state of Oklahoma should go back to a tribe. How do you handle that when our own courts are saying, yeah, Oklahoma doesn't belong to the United States, it's tribal land? So I think looking at this stuff honestly and having those tough conversations, and there's a paradox. I think, sometimes, Joseph, you asked me like, how could you translate this to somebody? And this is the tough part, I think, when it comes to like racism and oppression. When you have a group that's oppressing or committing a literal genocide, like in the United States, right? Somewhere between, 20 to 40 million and 170 to 250 million. We don't even know the exact numbers, right? Because there wasn't record keeping of how many people were killed for the most part. So when you're looking at that level of slaughter, it's hard to even accept. We really get upset about genocides that are in 6 to 8 million. You're looking at potentially over 100 million. You can't really make that right. There's not a walking that back. That's a sin that's been created so big. So you got to kind of look at where we're at now, acknowledge it, have those conversations, and then see like what might make things work today and what are we willing to sacrifice. And the myth is that this would mean everybody who's not indigenous suffering and to make up for the previous suffering. But the point is when you oppress one group, it costs something of the humanity. Our value in our life isn't from us being human and alive. It's the same way that keeps indigenous people from not getting access to good health care, land rights, clean water, keep people in Flint, Michigan, keep white people in the rural South. It divides everybody up and keeps us from realizing this kind of collective resource that we could all share and be doing well with. And so, in the end, I think the only way we're going to have salvation for the majority of people struggling in America is to acknowledge all the people struggling. And that means going back to the indigenous and how this country's worked. And we're not going to solve these medical issues and inequality without looking at the genetic exploitation of indigenous people as well.
Yeah, so um, it takes me back to again Star Trek. So, and I won't spend too much time on it, but um, Mexicans have been reclaiming their indigenous ancestry 25 years or more, right? So the Spanish caste system in most of Latin America made everybody embarrassed to be black or native. They all would claim either Spanish ancestry, even if they were black as night or, had a big indigenous face, right? They were still somehow Spanish, right? And that mestizaje has been slowly going away. And but now it's getting a lot of pushback from First Nations and American Indians, even though they might look like you and Kyle, right? Because they have some federally recognized sovereignty that says they're indigenous, but people in Mexico who look like me are no longer indigenous because we don't have recognition from the empire that we are indigenous. So, like, there's all this pushback, and that's been sort of a very subtle theme in Star Trek, like Kyle had said with the Klingons. Definitely with B'Elanna Torres because she was half Klingon. Her dad was Mexican from Earth, and she didn't want to be either. She didn't want to be Mexican from Earth. She didn't want to be Klingon. She didn't like her dad because her dad, whatever, divorced her mom. And then Chicote was he was a Mexican indigenous person, didn't want to learn his grandfather's ways. He just wanted to be modern and go out into the spaceship and all that kind of stuff. And then we have Cardassians who get adopted by Bajorans and all this kind of stuff. It's all in there. It's all in there. This idea of being assimilated, being mestizo, being white aspirationalist. It's all in there. And uh, to your point, I think that we have to face all of that history and talk about how we're related to each other, uh, whether that's through genetics or some history. Because if you can't describe it, then you can't believe that it's true. So, like you said, and I've been using AI, and before AI, I've been using NGO figures. So, right now, if you notice that since 2000, the population of American Indians went from about 1.7 million to almost 10 million between 2000 and the 2020 census. And there's a reason for that. There's a reason, at least in my mind, is because they want people who don't live on reservations to have more of a say so than people who live on reservations. So if you notice for the Washington Redskins debate about the mascot, they were like, well, we have all these natives over here who don't care and think it's okay to have the mascot. And they were using them to shout down the people who were more traditional that were opposed to the mascot issue, right? And like, well, when we look at those people who claim that they're native, they might not actually be native. And if they are, they don't have any connection to their indigenous roots, right? And then if you go to Latin America and you try to count Mexico, so my people are the Purepecha, from 2000 to 2020, they went from about 450,000 people to about 120,000 people. And they're like, we didn't go anywhere. We're still here. Like, how did the count go down? And in Latin American countries, especially like Colombia, where there used to be 4 million natives and now there's maybe 20,000, it's the outsiders that say, if you count your native people, we're not going to give you a loan because the World Bank says you have to protect those indigenous spaces like the Amazon. And if there's a bunch of Indians in the Amazon, you can't cut down the trees. So they're like, well, we don't have any natives anymore. They're mostly gone. So like these numbers games, these definitional games always serve the colonizer, right? And then to your last point about how this is all of our stuff, and it's just indigenous people are the canary in the coal mines. Data regulation for data and technology has not kept up with the actual data and technologies, right? So data is ubiquitous, it's promiscuous, it goes everywhere. These big companies have data plantations, patent plantations. So right now we're the obvious target, we're the obvious example, but it's going to hit everybody. It's going to hit African Americans, it's going to hit white Americans. Like this idea of ownership, it should be like you said in the commons, it should be like a utility, but it's not. It's all going to be privatized to somebody who can afford to develop it into a product.
I mean, I think if you look at something like 23andMe, it's a great example. A private company buries in the terms that, hey, can you give us your genetic data so that we can give you profile data? And everybody loved to go online on social media. They would intentionally use these tools of all these people like, I didn't know I was 2% Iroquois, or I didn't know I was like, I had, I don't know, French ancestry or something. Everybody's shocked and excited. And it has real utility. They catch the Golden State Killer. They identify certain genetic traits. They were able to help people get organ transplants. So there's utility behind this, but who owns it? So then the company goes default and we don't have modern mechanisms. So it's a HIPAA violation if you try and sell that data, right? You can't just sell it without the consent. But if you buy the company that owns it and it's a subsidiary, then that data hasn't even changed hands. And that's where the courts had to get involved because we don't even have a preparation for that. So what happens when companies are allowed to buy entire companies? We're not enforcing antitrust laws. We're not enforcing data protection under this deregulation. Well, that doesn't hurt just anybody. But I think one thing that's important is when you do point out how this is our shared concern, to not ignore the disproportionate harm that happens on certain groups. So, like, for example, because we committed this massive genocide throughout our entire nation, right? And I'd like it if that was just a fact. It'd be nice if we lived in a or we could say that happened. What do we do with that now? So now there are some places that do acknowledge that, and they say, look, if you find bones in the ground, you have to test them. And then here's what's even sicker. Well, once you test them, nobody owns that. It was bones in the ground. Now they get to go into a genetic database. And now who owns that genetic database when you're doing arbitrary testing of samples in the earth? Some of them don't have very much genetic material, some do. And when you're looking at health disparities, a lot of our treaties that we signed with tribes promised health care. That was part of the treatment. That was part of what enticed them to agree was that we'll give you advanced health care. And a lot of times that hasn't followed through. Our Supreme Court's ruled this, states have ruled this, and not much happens. So you come to these people and you say,
You know why though? That particular instance is
let's speak.
because we have this schizophrenia in the United States where economy and capitalism is the most important thing. We saw that during COVID. We can't stop trade. We have to keep doing things because that's the lifeblood of the United States, right? And that's all private. But on the other side, when we collect tax dollars to build roads, to fund schools, all that kind of stuff, and to do research, that is all very social. That's it's a version of socialism, right? You are taking tax dollars from the people to fund all of this stuff you need to build. And research, science, fails 99% of the time. A private company is not going to take that liability. They're not going to do that, right? So they rely on the social part, the half of the United States, like we're doing this for the public good, and then turning it into a private capital, right? And people don't understand that. Like we are divided in this way, right? And so this thing that you said, they promised tribal groups or vulnerable populations like African Americans or whoever some sort of benefit. There's no way to deliver it because you can only deliver the money for the research on one side. There is no money for public development on the other side. The last one was vaccines. No pharma company wanted to invest in vaccines when the United States was giving it away for free, not only to Americans, but all over the world. So guess who made those? The US military made those. So this is the thing that we have to solve is how do we get the promise of research and altruism through tax-funded research into the marketplace so that it actually does benefit everybody.
Well, I think there's some economists that talk about solutions, right? Because when you invite me here, it's both communicating the problem but looking at solutions. Alaska, for example, isn't a very, it's not thought of as the most progressive blue state, certainly, right? Overwhelmingly, it's a conservative red stronghold. And you have this narrative about social shared goods or not. Well, here's the thing. A group of people that evolved with the land over millennia did work, but then there's the land itself. And there's things that existed before Homo sapiens were on this planet. Oil was formed, how coal was compressed, rare earth minerals. We did nothing. That's like a cosmic force. That's the development of a planet. And so the move to privatize is to take what is collective and then create somebody's ownership. And to be fair, the theory is, well, somebody's going to be able to exploit that, but we'll all benefit from the exploitation. It's this, I benefit from the exploitation and quote, it trickles down, right? My company gets to extract the oil, we all get to drive our cars. What Alaska looks and says is, fine, maybe there's some truth to that. So what we can do is we can set up sovereign wealth funds. We can give people compensation for our shared resources. So if you live in Alaska, you get a check from oil companies and oil development because that's a shared resource that everybody should get a little part of. In some years it's really high, in some years it's lower. But the amount of collective development, I mean, there's this when I was in college, I had a great professor out of Harvard and he was teaching this course and he was talking about all the developments that came out of the space program. And these cliches like Velcro, but there were things from improvements to microtransistors to cathode ray tubes to insulation to new ceramics. And
Mhm.
what did we do? Well, some of that we gave to a company to develop. We took public funds, developed it, and a private company got to make it. Some of it we did put into the public sphere. And there's so many things that came out of the space program that we benefit from in day to day.
Mhm.
Silly materials, paints, ways TVs used to work. Like all that comes out of development on this public good. And we get to the moon in this moment that brings collective inspiration and hope, and we take it back and we have these shared resources. But I think there's a movement away by taking the public resources, giving them to a company to develop, and look at things like Palantir and others that are taking all of our data, conglomerating it together, putting it through the real thing that changes in society. There are movements up, down, technology moves, and we don't really usually go back. And there's these technological advancements on how efficient we can be at collecting huge amounts of data and storing it. Genomic data, right? A genetic test used to take a year. It was a moonshot. The DNA to sequence one genome. Now you can do it in what, a week maybe or less. Some in a few days. We can do simple genetic markers.
Yeah, in
So you
about a
can
week.
take
Yeah.
yeah, all this data, fast, efficient, shove it together in databases and have systems that can read through them like lightning in a way no human could. We have all this advanced technology. What are we going to do with that shared data? And there's two models we can do. We can say, okay, the one who can exploit it the most and control it, they get all the data and all the benefit. And we hope we get some spillover on what they'll release to us. Or we can make this a shared good because you can't have massive databases of genetic data without masses of people. And so the
Yeah.
question is the one who exploits it or the one that has it, the one where it occurs? Where's the value?
I think it's actually there's actually a middle way. And I think that if you look at indigenous sovereignty as it's been treated, like that is the third way, right? So like you touched on this a little earlier about like an all or nothing. Like we've got to either exploit everything practically with corporations like on the ground. We got to cut indigenous people away from their land and get to the land directly so we can make it productive and like there's no social ownership of anything. And we have this this debate in the United States about capitalism versus socialism, but like there is a large groupings of socialist activities in the U.S. The military is a like the most perfect socialist institution, most successful on the planet, right? And like the way to solve the data sovereignty issue, the Omix issue, the way to respect indigenous sovereignty in general is by mediation between groups. Like if the Cherokee Nation, for example, wants to protect the genome of its citizens and you as a scientist want access to that, you have to go through the nation. And like we have to have, and I think we are kind of having this conversation publicly. We just haven't labeled it like this. We have to have a conversation as a culture, but that's how you respect different groups of people in the empire, is you lean into the sovereignty they naturally have. And I think Joseph is definitely working in this direction. Like these layers of approvals and protections, and if we're protecting a certain data set for a certain group, you can't access that without the correct permissions, and everyone has to be in agreement. That consensus building has to be part of the conversation. And like we are just now in the culture, despite all the nonsense of the last 10 or 25 years of our politics, like just now starting to have that kind of conversation. And as usual, the indigenous experience is there first because fighting for sovereignty has laid the legal groundwork for most of this stuff, which is why native bio is in Cheyenne River, right?
Yeah, it's funny because, and I got pushback about 3 or 4 weeks ago from somebody at a federal department. But I'm like, we've been talking about data sovereignty since at least 2007, right? And the United States didn't care. They've just had this whole open data, open access, open science framework, which got really uh, debated at the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Math or Medicine back in 2013. And then it got codified by the Biden administration in 2023 to have everything open, right? And I'm like, we've been talking about data sovereignty for a long time. But then in 2022, there's a bunch of language in the America Competes Act that says, they have to protect all this American data from China, right, or Iran, or Russia, right? Like all the data that is being generated from any kind of science with public tax dollars has to be protected. And just recently in December, the Department of Justice said that they want anything that has over 1,000 data points has to be centralized and controlled by Homeland Security, right? And they again they cite China, right? And so one of the reasons why 23andMe didn't get sold to Regeneron was because Dick Durbin from Illinois, the senator from Illinois, said, "Hey, don't we have a law that we passed in 2022 that we have to protect our data from China?" And Regeneron, along with Illumina, has contacts with China, and China's genomic venture capital fund. Like we can't sell it to Regeneron because this is all American data. And so that's why Regeneron backed off, right? And so now the lady from 23andMe turned it into a nonprofit, but she's still selling that data. Like it's a nonprofit, but she's still selling that data. But anyway, my comment to them was like, you guys didn't even care about data sovereignty until like the last 3 years. And they're like, oh no, we always cared about it. I'm like, then why did you make all data and science open? Like, how can you put those two things together? You're not talking the same language where you want to have data open, as Brier is talking about, so that it is a common resource. It is something that everybody can draw from the well. But at the same time, you're like, if you don't prove that you don't have either graduate students or partners that somehow have a connection to China, we are not going to give you any federal money. It
I
doesn't.
think I think I think it can be even more pernicious in a way because if you look at like 23andMe, for example, right? It's a private company doing this service that people want, right? They've consented to. But nowadays we're so flooded with consent that it's there's this idea like FPIC, right? Free, prior, informed consent. And there's a couple of keywords there. One is free. So if I'm in duress, like what will happen with these indigenous communities, and Joseph, you probably have some examples of this, is they'll come in and they'll have these communities that don't have access to healthcare clinics. So what they'll say is, look, we will test you, we will give you blood tests, we'll screen cholesterol, diabetes, all these health issues that you don't have access to. And in exchange for that, like we're going to need to run those tests. So you're going to have to sign waivers. Well, in those waivers, a lot of times what they're saying is it's pretty standard, but you're giving up the rights to your blood for testing. And buried in there, they say this will be for research. It says through a university. So all these people didn't know they were signing away one of their most intimate things, their genetic profiles. And so then those genetic profiles are sold. So one of the ideas of a true free, prior, and informed consent is you are can't be coerced into it. You have to have done this in advance. It's not on them to retroactively get it or to make amends. You have to give prior consent, and it has to be informed. So when they're signing away their blood, to simply say, we've given away, fine, you've signed it, but not all people think like, imagine if 10 years from now, somebody hears, we've cloned your cells, like Henrietta Lacks, right? A woman of color who had a unique tumor who was used hugely influential in cancer samples, but her genetic material was taken without her. Her cells were taken and used without her ability to know, and her family. It comes up later. And so imagine that one of those people finds out, let's say something we're talking about fictional things. Somebody's genetic information is really useful, an algorithm finds it, so they decide to clone that person. I don't think anybody who says, okay, you can test my data thinks they're submitting for cloning. So the idea of free prior informed consent is also that you have to be informed of whatever's happening. So you have to get a little card saying, do I want to let my data? Well, maybe I have a family member who's going through Parkinson's, right? Maybe they're really comfortable with releasing their data. I have another one who just went through cancer, cutting edge, targeted treatment, and a specific test made for her unique unidentifiable tumor. So out there's a little test, a her test, and it might be useful for somebody in the future. She had the opportunity to be explained, like, when you give this up, we're going to make this test, but that company owns the test. They own you. They own your tumor that happened in your body, your genetic profile associated with it, and they might use it on other people.
Yeah.
And the idea of being informed on this, that's work.
And
And
you
I think
can't.
it's the
It's impossible nowadays. It's too
exactly.
much. It's too much. So to your point, I wanted to point out that FPIC is an UNDRIP concept, the United Nations of Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. That's different from the Belmont Report and the Common Rule, which is just informed consent, right? And they don't match because one is dynamic. It's ever changing. You're always supposed to
Yeah.
let people know. And you can't do that in the modern technology because data is now permanent in AI. You can't, like in the old days, you could pull your data. You were supposed to pull data from dead or deceased participants. You can't do that. Data is permanent now. Like, and then, like you said, nobody understands cloning. Now they take your cells and they'll take them backwards to make them pluripotent stem cells. They don't explain that to you. I mean, it might be somewhere kind of in there tangentially, but like you don't understand that not only is your data going to be used for all of these things outside the original consent through secondary data use, but you are going to be made permanent by the AI platform, and you're going to be made permanent by taking these cell cultures and turning them backwards to like when you were an embryo. So then they can move them forwards, backwards, sideways, whatever they want. It's still you, just like Henrietta Lacks, but it's not anything that you can conceive of or understand for the future. And that's the problem where FPIC and the common rule are different, right? And like I said, one is dynamic consent.
Right.
And the other one is in the United States, because we're capitalists, is a one and done contract.
I think
It's not dynamic.
I think it's important when you're like, this can't happen. It could, but some types of exploitation wouldn't survive it. So, for example, if your genetic material is really valuable, you might say, I'm not willing like to just have my genetic data floating out there. If some company came to you and said, look, I'm going to offer you $10 million. We think this is invaluable. You might look and have to do that calculus of having my genetic material out there or having those resources to make myself secure, to make material changes in the world, to donate to my community, to buy a yacht, whatever you want to do with that money. And it puts more work on the people with power. One and done consent is really easy because I can trick you, coerce you, do whatever, and it's a legalistic framework. You've signed it, I owe nothing to you. We've signed the contract. It's this traditional, like, I tell you, I teach philosophy, it's this contractual view, right? As long as you're consenting to agreements, private property ownership, that's all that matters. It really ignores the legitimate ignorance that most of us have about the world, that
Or
conditions
the
can be
or the
different.
humanity. Like
Right.
that's not
Right.
how human groups are supposed to act, right? That's not, it's just like you're not, they make you property and they make you the arbiter of that property, right? And so people don't understand that genetics, like you said, the Golden State Killer, they couldn't, because of legal reasons, they could not do a lot of things with that data. So what they did was they went to amateur genealogists and third-party platforms like GEDmatch, and then tried to match the sample that they had from the toilet because the Golden State Killer took a shit. They took his poop and then they tried to match it to these third-party algorithms, and they had these amateur genealogists who never get any attention, all of a sudden getting all of this attention from law enforcement. And then they went through and they matched it up to like six or seven possibilities, and that's how they caught him, right? People don't understand that you, as one person who gives permission, are giving permission for your whole family group. And in places like Native America, where we're more similar to each other than you guys are similar to each other, those statistics are even more threatening. So, like my friend did a study in the Southwest. So, usually for forensics, with the 13 biomarkers, now it's like 32 biomarkers. That's supposed to be a 1 in a million chance that you got the wrong person. But in a lot of places like native groups, it's more like 1 in 1,000 chance you're going to make a mistake and pick the wrong person. So, but it works the other way where you're highly identifiable. So, like if I gave permission for my family, I'm probably giving permission for 1 million people to so that they know what we have inside of us. And so with AI and the way that AI can breadcrumb, if they get my sample and say I have some immune resistance to HIV, they're going to say, where can we find more of that? Oh, we can go to Mexico. We know where he came from. We're going to sample all of those people and figure out how to stop HIV.
And there's a world in which that's beneficial. If you're consenting and aware, like we've all probably had to get a lab done, right? Or at least everybody in the world should have access to labs and get their health checked out. If one day I took a lab and let's say somehow it comes out, look, you have this unique thing that could save people's lives with HIV, I would absolutely be like, I'm willing to give up some of my privacy to have that good in the
Yeah,
world.
but you
But I
wouldn't.
wouldn't probably what you're about to say. I wouldn't sell it to a private company that could sell it. I'd want to control how it was used. I'd want to make sure it wasn't sold for, I was not one of these drugs that they mark up by 10,000%. I'd want to make sure it was accessible, it was democratic, that it got to people that needed it. And I think that's one of the challenges in is it the person that can utilize the data that should have the rights, or is it the person whose data it is? And to be really honest, I think we'd all agree this is starting to sound like sci-fi. We're cloning your cells. What are we going to do with you? What about the dead cultures when we're digging up the dead and we're recreating them? Common genealogy and how can we fight disease? Identifying family and friends. It starts to sound so like
Don't even
surreal.
don't even bring up George Church because like right now in New Zealand, everybody is like against George Church and Colossal because they're like, we don't want to de-extinct any of these people. We don't need a dire wolf. We don't need a mammoth. Like we don't need a moa. Just leave them alone. Leave them extinct. Blah blah blah. But to your point, I wasn't gonna say not sell it to a private company. What I was going to say is I wouldn't disempower my group just because it benefited me or a few other people, right? Because
Yeah.
Yeah.
this makes permanent our disempowerment as Native people. If we want to fight for land back or tribal identity or anything else, by giving away one DNA sample, I allow all of these races to say, you guys are not from here, you're immigrants from Siberia, and we're going to take away all your stuff because now we have the money to do so. Like you don't own it anymore. You don't own your land. You don't own your DNA. You don't own your children because we own it, right? And that's the problem with genetics is like you can disempower a whole group of people by taking away one sample. And that's to me is something that people don't understand.
Yeah. That's why I like the idea of the sovereignty layer as a middleman. It's a lot like the old fight, which is still going on between capital and labor. It wasn't the union was really a godsend. It pulled back some of those rights for the collective group. You know, the genomics issue right now, there's got to be a collective group legally identified that can actually do damage in this arena, or else like every group loses.
Yeah, so you and I, Kyle, have talked about this because you like Ursula K. Le Guin. I like Ursula K. Le Guin. My friend Jenny Reardon, who's an ethicist at the UC Santa Cruz, we all say the same thing. It's like, what kind of society do we want to live in if, like Brier is saying, everybody in those who walk away from Omelas are benefiting? It's a perfect society. It's utopic. It's great. But there's one little kid suffering in that closet. That's Native American. So, yeah, we could solve a lot of the world's medical problems with a couple of samples of DNA. But then the rest of us that are still surviving might go extinct. And that's the other myth is like, so I do talk to indigenous groups who are hopelessly mixed with African or Native, sorry, with Europeans, right? And they're just like, we're in this situation where in order to get something, we have to give something, and we can't claim any sort of uniqueness anymore. But they try to say that for Native Americans that we're all mixed, but there's plenty of like just Arizona has full bloods.
It-
Alaska has full bloods. Canada has full bloods. And if you go further into Latin America and Amazon and Bolivia and Peru and Ecuador, there's still full bloods. So there is still something. And then we have to fight. And I think Brier brought it up earlier. How do you fight racialization?
Mhm.
We don't want to be racialized, but we also want to protect our unique geography and adaptational history to this place. Like they're related, but they're not the same, and you can abuse one for the other's purpose.
Yeah, that'd be my one hot take that all your indigenous friends would hate me for is that the way indigenous nations reckon their citizenship is mostly based on a white supremacy system. And like, how do you do it another way? And there are other ways. Like modern nation states that aren't patently Native American nations, like, you know, Spain or whatever, India, like they don't genetically test you to become a citizen. They do other mechanisms, and I don't know how to solve that in the nations of Native America, but like you can determine group membership by other metrics, and you should. And like honestly, the genes are deeply important, but they're being separated out for exploitation. So the people who want to oppose that also have to treat it differently. And it isn't the same marker of lineage that it always once was. It still is, but like if you're a citizen of Cherokee Nation, like you're in the group already, man. You don't need to blood test me. Let's move together on this or something. And I've had this conversation with some indigenous people, friends of Joseph's, and they don't know what to think of me, but it's true. Like that, it's white supremacy is based on those in the modern era. So how do you divorce yourself of it? I don't know.
Most of the academics I know that are part of the indigenous community point out that blood quantum was literally designed by white supremacists, genocidal colonizers that were coming here to take through manifest destiny. We're going to take coast to coast, slaughter you all, and hope history looks at us if we're successful as great champions. And they come up with this blood quantum. And to be fair, in my experience, that's the other thing about the flattening, right? If you make indigenous people like a race, like we're all kind of indigenous somewhere. And even me, I'm a mixture of a lot of different types of descent. Those were very different cultures, like Greek and Norwegian, like really different cultures. They had some interaction and they didn't for I don't know how long, probably millennia have much interaction. Uh, a lot of what I think we want to do, and this is a broader philosophical question, I think we want to be efficient, right? Think of algorithms. We want efficient use of data, economics, and efficiency usually breeds a kind of monstrosity almost always because it so focuses on one thing. That's what axiomatically efficiency means, right? So if we're being efficient about identifying people, let's get some quick categories. Race, gender, age, and think of things that give bigotry. There's a great philosopher out of Utah who talks a lot about games, and he's using literal video games and stuff. And he makes this point on how you score things shapes entirely how you play. And eventually that goes beyond games to how we live in society. So if we want to be efficient and make profit, reducing people to simple metrics, we can, it's called flattening and smoothing the complexity of a person. So we take all indigenous and flatten and smooth it. The Inuit are the same as the Cherokee, are the same as the Arapaho. You're all the same. And what does it mean to be Arapaho? Well, we can't have it used to be by family tie and genetic and tradition around religion and the building of facilities and sweat lodge and teepee and the type of person you are in the community. That's complicated. We have different rules. How do we integrate? Blood. It's genetic. And yet to be an American, this is one of the fights we're having right now that ties to racism and bigotry. It's not genetic what makes you American, right? That's where we have a fight over birthright. Is it because you're born on the soil? Is that it? Is it because your ancestors came here on a boat when they were still like signing quick documents? That's how most of my family came here. $5 from Greece, came on a ship, thought they'd see gold on the streets and was blown away looking at New York. What is this? Where's all the marble and the beautiful stuff like I had back home? Oh no. So, there's this history of what makes a person and their identity, and that's hard. And tribes might have different, like, I'd imagine that both of you, your experience, tribes have different standards for what makes somebody a tribe. Tribes used to have exchanges of families and lineage and adoption and types of slavery. Like there's a whole history of indigenous peoples in different places. And so we flattened it to genetic. And if the government were to look at these groups as sovereign nations, as individuals, give them freedomcy and agency to existentially define themselves, that would be a lot of work and create gray areas. Like, there are people in my family that would be considered part of Arapaho that are not genetically Arapaho. And there's other groups of Arapaho that might say, wait, actually, no, we don't want you included in our group. So which group gets to define what's a member of the tribe? And I think under the altar of efficiency, we're willing to sacrifice a lot because it can be profitable.
So we're running up on time. We got probably about 6 minutes left, but go ahead, Kyle, real quick, and then I'm gonna.
Oh no, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say this idea, and we kind of touched on it earlier, of a lack of nuance, right? So this efficiency concept, we were talking about it in New Zealand because it was a genomic standards conference, and I just saw an article on LinkedIn that said the same thing. By having data open and trying to standardize for efficiency actually makes science worse because you don't realize that the technologies change over time. Your new conclusions that you get from the data changes over time. So if you try to standardize too much, you lose all of that fine-grained nuance that you're trying to capture. Like this group over here is doing it that way, that group's doing it over there that way. They're doing it different ways because they're asking different questions. If you standardize, then all the questions get flattened. Right. And so it says open data is actually probably hurting science
Hmm.
because you're trying to be efficient, like you said, especially with such huge, huge data sets, and our minds can't do it, right? And that same thing um, applies to this question. So this notion of altruism and that we're going to raise all boats doesn't really work in the Americas, right? Because we are very, very different. There was a study that was done in 2012 or 13 where it said the people from Western Mexico compared to the people from Eastern Mexico are 5 times more different than a European is from a Chinese person because of the way of the selective sweeps have happened, the genetic drift has happened, the isolation from across mountain ranges has happened in the Americas. We didn't have this big homogenizing event like you did in Africa or Europe. We're still very different, distinct peoples. So while you are pitching funding and research in this flattening way in order to get your way, the smart people like me say, I know where to go. I'm going to go to the Navajo, or I'm going to go to this group because I know that they're different and I'm going to find something unique in them because I, as a geneticist, know that they're different. And that's the shell game. That's the lie, right? And so then we have that same sort of issue, which is what I wanted you guys to both talk about at the beginning, is you're stuck in a catch-22. Natives cannot win. If it's the prime directive and you're saying you're protecting us from ourselves because you don't want to give us technology, right? You're protecting and you're letting us evolve unnaturally. We're screwed. If it's the other thing, like John Wayne, that says you're not using the land, you're not digging copper out of the ground, you're not cutting down the trees. Let us show you how to do it, and then still not give us anything. You just take the land. We're screwed that way too. So we're screwed coming or going. If you flatten it and say, yes, we're gonna treat all natives the same and help them, you get screwed. If you say, oh no, I'm gonna attend to your differences and treat you special, you're screwed.
I think I'm sure Kyle has some to add, but a lot of different cultures have come up with this idea of like a middle path. And I think it's going back to using efficiency just because we've already touched on this. It's very efficient to go all or nothing, right? Because then I don't have to think about it. I don't have to deal with nuance. So I think there's a way that we can look at something like how do we advance and say, look, we're going to deal with you as people. We're going to engage with you, like you mentioned, dynamic over time. If we try and flatten it all down to like, here you're on your own, we're just going to leave you, well, then they're stuck. They're stuck because I'm going to use the United States. We've been using this metaphor a lot. You're stuck as nations within a nation without full sovereignty, but partial sovereignty, with a lot of history of inequity that you're suffering from. And there's not this full independence, right? They can't sign treaties. They can't, arm themselves in a certain way. They can't tap into their own natural resources and have full water rights, right? They can't do that. They can't sell off the Colorado River. And a lot of them, I think a lot of tribes wouldn't want to, from my experience in engaging with them. And of course, they need to speak for themselves, right? I'm not trying to speak for anybody, but there's diversity here. So I think what's hard is we need some degree of both. The right thing to do is if I come up to somebody and I hit them with my car, right, because I'm not paying attention or something, I should owe them recompense. I should make them whole. But I also should be decent and help them right away. I should jump out of the car. I should see if they're okay. I might sacrifice my day, my flow. It might be easy for me to hit and run and go about it. And we legally even recognize that. Like you have a duty to be decent. But I think we often others the other so much. We want to atomize people, separate the tribes, separate the identities, make it all about these different groups. So it allows a powerful thing like a company or a government or even a university system to exploit every little group that's chopped up and they can't come together. So it's important to bring people together to the table to talk about this. And at the same time, it might feel paradoxical or counterintuitive, but to recognize they're all individuals. So they have unique views and perspectives. And what does that mean? It's messy work. And if that were my big takeaway, it's to say these are living groups of people that are still here. They're also historical groups that have been killed. It's also nations within nations that are and aren't recognized. It's research that a lot of tribes want to take part in and could benefit themselves and others, and they want to, but also don't want to be exploited. So it's maybe a cry that we're experiencing everybody. You hear this from all populations all across America and the world. Slow down, be deliberate, be conscious, and we're less depressed, stressed, anxious, and pressured if we have the time to be more human and alive versus dead digital data points. Living things are not just data points. That would be my takeaway.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with the middle way. It reminds me a little bit of interfaith chapels you see in airports. There's like no reason to build those rooms. There's not a tangible, practical reason for that. People just feel it. And, we take the time, we spend however much money it takes to build those spaces for people to enjoy for spiritual reasons. And that's okay. It's a little bit of bureaucracy. It makes people who enjoy those spaces happy. And what's wrong with that? A little bit of going slower is the right. I like the way you put that.
Yeah, and that's the thing is, so I just wrote a Substack post where there's this assumption that we're all Malthusian, we're all Darwinian, all these really crappy, shallow philosophical takes, that society is inherently greedy, that there's one human nature, we're competitive and we're violent, right? I don't agree with that. I don't think that's true, right? But right now we are because everybody is not trusting each other. Canada, the United States, China, Russia, Iran, nobody trusts each other, right? So they're all trying to get as much data as possible, as fast as possible. So I was talking to an NIH rep a few years ago, and I said, look, do you want to do this right? Or do you just want the data? He's like, I just want the data.
Honesty is also a virtue, I guess.
I think in the end, that's the point is sometimes when we need something, we just want it. And sometimes when we want something, we confuse it that that's what we need. And this is one of those situations where I think being conscious and aware, using basic ideas like consent and information and equity over time and justice and they're messy ideas, but all of us win when we do that. Like there's actually no losers. I think this might be a controversial take if you want one. I think even the rich exploiters that are trying to do this, the billionaire people that are at the tops of these companies that are willing to make these sacrifices of others for profit, the nation states that want to be dominant. I think there's an internal cost to living that way. So I do think there's a way that's a win-win for everybody for shifting this, but our society actually encourages us to recognize and care more about those. There's a term called perverse incentives, right? I want to be the richest at all possible, so I should exploit everything. I want to be the dominant nation, so I should kill others and oppress my own people to be efficient at that. It creates these perverse systems that we all see are bad. But if those systems get big enough and run unchecked, then as individuals, we start to internalize that. And I think right now that's the big fight we're seeing globally with the rise of all these different extremist movements trying to shift the current world order. It's not working for most humans. We're more depressed, we're more anxious, we have more healthcare, more resource, but we're not doing better. A lot of people don't feel that. And so what are we fighting for in the end? To just die with more money in our pockets or have giant corporations with the greatest wealth ever in our nation? If we're not feeling better, what's it for? and we're not giving something sustainable for future generations to feel better. So that's my calls. I think there's a way to make this all better and nobody loses, but we're encouraging people to think somebody would lose and live that way.
Yeah, and I think so. There is this paper called Consent is Not a Contract, and they're using the metaphor of a sorority girl being stuck in a room with a bunch of fraternity guys. She might at one point want to be with those guys, but at some point when she sobers up, she's like, I don't want to be with those guys anymore. And that's the way consent for research should work. I changed my mind. At some point, I liked this, I wanted to do it, but I don't want to do it anymore. And that can happen at any point in time. You can change your mind because you are human. You don't have to participate in this system or this research or this relationship. Like, people don't understand that. And I think that us, everybody, over and above the government, over and above corporations, have to say that, like, we're human. These things belong to all of us, and we don't have to participate in your messed up game. You're, like you said, perverse incentives. We don't have to participate in that program.
Yeah, I think there's something beautiful about acknowledging what it is to be alive in the world. And I've recently been using this term necronomics, which is like it's an economics of death.
Mhm.
And the opposite is like it's not bionomics, it's not just an economics of life, but it's like bio thriving.
Yeah.
You know, it's biogenesis. It's like let's give power to life and what it means to be alive. And in my experience, a lot of indigenous cultures, because they're so tied to the land, they're tied to the life, they're tied to the earth, they're tied to the environment, and they view it as a stewardship because they see life over time. Like there's all these, I'm going to use a cliche that's overused, but there's the seventh generation idea and all these things that get turned into a group of products that you can buy near where I live. But the idea is that we're part of a living system that goes over time and is dynamic. And I think there's a desire, and this bleeds through, and the economics affects science and it affects military and nation states. We're more in love with like the dead data, the objective point, the metric, the system that isn't alive, and we ignore what it is to actually be alive. So I'm constantly trying to point out to people when we're taking this necronomic view that it's dead data that's owned by a company that produces a product. What does that product do if every human dies on Earth? Like, it's not like it has some existential value. It's only of utility to the things that are alive. So don't lose the living, quote, to the service of the living. Don't embrace these dead data points, dead ideas, flatten a human out to their genetic profile only and one signed form, make everything about a currency that isn't alive itself, right? I mean, if everybody, the last thing I'll say is in preparing for this, I had a conversation with a woman who's doing a really interesting study. Um, and it was actually with a group, John, the same friend you're talking about. Some of us were getting together, and she was representing a European biopharma company, and she was going to places with uncontacted tribes for a very interesting reason, because they don't have soap. They don't have lots of skin disease. They don't have all these problems. So their skin microbiome was so valuable that these companies were spending millions of dollars to fly people to nearly uncontacted tribes, talk to intermediary tribes that could speak their language and engage with them, and try and go and get skin samples, not like cutting off skin, but swabs and stuff from these people that had never been exposed to soap in their life to see what type of thing would live and how they would live to try and treat things like antibiotic resistant infections and things. And she gave this example of rings. It's like life. There's an outer ring. And she said when she talked to them, what did they want? They wanted clothing and money because they had trouble getting clothing there and they knew money could buy them anything. These people had cars and cell phones and knew. Then there was a middle reign, right? And what they wanted was food and medicine because they knew about Western medicine. They could understand things like diabetes. They could get their friend with a cell phone, but they might live in a more indigenous way in a forest or something like that. Then there's an inner ring, and she realized that these groups were signing consent forms. When she got to the inner ring, her translator was trying to explain how she came there to meet them. And she said this thing that stuck with me. The only word they could use for plane was insect because they didn't have a concept for what metal or engines or fuels or planes would be. And it wasn't like a bird because the wings weren't moving. So they'd seen a few planes over time, and conceptually, all they could imagine were these were insects very high up, large insects. So she had to talk with these people saying she came in on an insect in the sky, almost like something out of a mythological story. And it's not to infantilize, like this is what these people didn't have the language, they didn't have the experience. And then she was getting consent to them to take their samples. And at one point she realized these people don't understand any of these
That's not
terms.
informed consent. Yeah.
No, and so she did something very controversial. She chose to destroy and burn a lot of those samples. And she asked me not to use her name because, like that millions of dollars were spent on sending her to do this, and she realized these people didn't know. She had near life situations. These people protected her where she was under threat from others and all this stuff. And she had this rich experience, but she realized like even within this tribal group, there were these, she used this example, and I'm going to share it, these rings, and the concerns were different. And the people on the outside ring might want the money and compensation. That's great for them. The people in the middle, she said, literally, they showed money and talked about it.
Mhm.
They didn't want to engage with the money at all because to them they literally couldn't conceive of that system. It was they looked at it as fuel. But what was valuable to the people in the middle, they'd seen enough metal to think metal was this magic material because it could go in a fire and not burn, because the knife could be sharpened. So if they were to trade their genetic data, they would offer like all their samples for a couple of pots. And how do you explain to them, no, you want $1 million, you could buy million, you could be set for pots for life. There wasn't even a way to communicate. And that's the free prior informed consent. But it's also how valuable, it's such a great story because it illustrates how valuable something we've never thought of. These people that just have never used soap and survive and thrive without infection. How do they do it? And that's why I say, is this a serious issue or not? These people that these companies know. They're willing to spend tens of millions of dollars to fly somebody around the world and do research because they know those indigenous people, their skin, their genetics, their environment, it's really valuable. And I think there's a very tough way where we think about how we can engage there and do something truly mutually beneficial without exploitative, without just a legal framework that flattens them down. You sign the consent form like they didn't have written signature. Do you give a thumbprint? How do you even do that? So that's my I guess takeaway in this is something that will help us all and could help those people in a way they could consent to and understand, but it just takes work and time. And that's what I hope we're all willing to do is spend a little more time and work and make a little sacrifice. And in the end, there's nobody that has to lose. We could have a mutually beneficial pact, but if it has to be efficient, somebody's going to lose out. It's going to be a zero-sum game.
So I'm gonna let Kyle have the last word here, Kyle. Make it good.
I, it is no brilliant insight. Just I agree with what you're saying, Briar. I like that example. I love the insect in the sky and the concentric circles. And I mean, th there is a way to do all of this, like you're saying, and be and make everybody happy. Everybody can win. Even if we move a little bit slower, it's probably for the best. We're moving too fast. We're breaking too many things, including people.
Yeah, so I would sum up my experience anyway with all of this stuff since 2007 is everybody keeps telling me don't let perfection be a barrier to the good. And according to what Briar just said, I'm like, how about we don't let the possibility, the speculation of some future good be a barrier to being good right now? With that,
I love that idea.
yeah,
And I've it's a mantra somebody else gave me through philosophy, and it's are we more concerned today with seeming good or doing good?
yeah,
Because sometimes doing good doesn't look good to everybody and it's hard work.
yeah,
And I strive to live up to that standard. I'm constantly working out because I was raised in a culture where looking good, having everybody say you're good, giving you recognition, that's what's valuable. And sometimes, the person, the janitor who's doing the good work of keeping a space clean for the kids that are learning is
yeah.
doing work that often isn't recognized by society, but is invaluable in the same way the principal that organizes all the teachers. So sometimes doing good doesn't get recognized and might even have a cost on us. And I hope we can shift to a world where we do good for more and don't live into this false frame of a zero-sum game where one culture has to dominate another and hurt. That's that colonial exploitation mindset. So shifting from this necronomic mutual exploitation for dead things to a thriving biosphere, an environmental view of living and thriving together. So yeah, I appreciate that.
And by the way, for the audience, go look up Joseph Akile Mbembe from Africa. He's still alive. He's still putting out YouTube videos about necropolitics, um, to what Brier was alluding to. But this has been Kyle Sullivan, Brier Buchalter. I'm Joseph Irasheta. This has been Genomic Discussions for the channel LoveDigenous. And thank you guys very much for watching.